welcome everybody to this panel, with a most remarkably stunning panellists. I can say that for absolute certain. I was part of the selection process, so so I know you're fabulous. Now, what I wanted to do actually was introduce everybody first, and then just talk a little bit about what we're actually here to do today. Ngāti Hua Te Rurawa Ranapiri, as curator of Māori at Alexander Turnbull Library. He's the author of Fire in Your Belly, Māori Leaders Speak, Makariti Taking Māori to the World, Savage to Suit, Māori and Cartooning in New Zealand, and Downfall, your latest and greatest. Wow, congratulations. And he's previously worked as an oral historian, broadcaster, and in 2017 he was awarded Creative New Zealand's Berlin Writers' Residency. Well done. Wow, okay, fantastic. Esme Ranapiri is Ngāti Rākau Te Arawa Ngāti Pūkeko. Sorry, they are a poet who lives in Ngāti Wairiri Whenua. He's author of Ransack and Kidna, and co-editor of Kupu Toi Takatapui Literary Journal. They have a great love of language, land back, and hot chips, and they will write until they're dead. So if that's a promise, that's great. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, we want you to do that. Oscar Upperton. Oscar lives in Wellington. His first collection of poetry was New Transgender Blockbusters and was published by University Press of Victoria. His second collection, The Surgeon's Brain, follows the life of 19th century surgeon Dr. James Barry. It was published in 2022, so we've got 2 brand new books out. Fabulous. So what a great group of people to talk about the issues that we have here. And I just want to look at and draw your attention to the fact that we all have a story, and that's what we're talking about today. Our stories are our taonga, they're our treasures. We make choices every day around how we tell our story, what parts we shout and what parts we whisper. We tell the stories of others and we tell our own. There is plenty of grey space in the biography genre that is ripe for discussion. And we'll be doing that today. For instance, who owns your story when it is out in the world? What about the stories of those who feature in an autobiography? How do we advocate for ourselves, but still leave enough space for different perspectives to shine? Our distinguished panelists will be discussing this in just a second. So, and we come from different positions, I guess, in this. So, life writing. So let's start, I guess, with the question in a way, or the opportunity to think about the issues. Yours, someone else's story, life writing. What attracts you to it? And maybe we could move down the panelists, and how has it expressed itself in your work? And I think we'll just start with that, if that's okay. Paul.
Kia ora. Tēnā tātou. Ina āhuatango te wā. I guess I'm here on this panel more as a non-fiction biography sort of person. Memoir, autobiographical writing is something I'm not too confident about, and to be honest, one of the reasons my book, I've produced the other books a bit more with a bit more speed, but this one took 18 years, which is a crazy length of time. It's not a record. I do know historians in Wellington who've taken longer to do their books. So there's a lot of competition for that record, for the longest gestation. And this book, I wasn't quite sure what sort of book it was. You may know it's about a hidden history, you know, the Wanganui mayor who was secretly homosexual and blackmailed by another secretly homosexual man. There was a lot of secret homosexuality going on in the 1920s in New Zealand. But I'd originally thought, well, maybe I should try and put myself in there, and you know, and that's how I was establishing my connection to that story. I'm not from Wanganui, I'm not related to either of these guys, but I sort of thought, well, these are like our queer ancestors, and perhaps that's how, you know, by following this story. But when I finally gave my manuscript to the publisher, and the editor, the wonderful editor, Anna Rogers in Christchurch, looked at it and she said, Paul, there's 2 things wrong with this. You shouldn't be in it, and you need to work on your structure, your time structure. So I was like, oh, well, this is why you pay these people. And I trust, I've learned you have to trust your editors. And she took me out. And I mean, last night I used some of that material that I had taken out, because that was really the first time I talked about me in the story following the path of these 2 men. So it wasn't wasted. And then she helped me restructure it, and it's a much stronger thing. And what people have said to me, of course, is I am there. You know, I am there in Berlin and Wanganui and London. You know, it's not explicit, but I am still there. But I guess, Joe, your question, I'm just attracted to writing by people like, you know, Janet Malcolm, Jill Lepore, who's a journalist for The New Yorker. These people who can convey a sense of what it's like, what it might have been like to live these people's lives. Over summer I read The Magician by Com Toibin, and I guess he's another inspiration. If you've read The Master about Henry James, you know, this imagining of someone's life and the kind of longing that he felt for men. It's totally imagined, but Sam Ducker-Jones's father, Lloyd Jones, said to me once, you know, there's literary truth. If you buy it, it's true. And there's an argument about that, and he's at one end of that continuum about that argument, but I've always thought that was interesting. If you buy it on the page, then it's true, if you believe it in terms of literary truth. And then we might get to talk about that sort of, you know, where does creative non-fiction start and finish and things, but maybe that's a start for me.
Yes.
Kia ora. What was the question again?
Okay, I'm gonna reframe that question. So life writing, yours, someone else's. What attracts you to it? So I know you've been in that area, working in that area.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in. I don't know. I think the lives I'm interested in are complicated in regards to their, like, fictionality. So like with Ransack, my first collection of poetry, I was responding to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, who was based on like real people, but you know, is a fictional character. But there is this kind of conversation that goes on in there about like the difference in our queerness and the difference in like the kind of cultural contexts between us. And I think that's like a really interesting thing to think about when you're writing, is like the gaps we have between each other, even if we share things, and like thinking about like queer ancestors and like finding how you relate to each other and how you don't, and what that means, I think is really interesting. I have a lot of questions, which is why I write poetry, because I think that's a really good form to like kind of, you know, investigate things rather than solve things. And yeah, and then in my second book, Echidna, is about a kind of interpretation of the Greek Titan Echidna, who was the mother of monsters. So like the Hydra and Chimera and those things. If you have seen Disney's Hercules, you're probably familiar with it. Yeah, and then trying to take that and making her like this kind of young queer Māori woman, kind of moving through, I don't know, different time periods, but like the 90s and early 2000s, and how, I don't know, reaching to other people or characters, you can discover something about yourself, and I think that's really cool. I don't know. Your turn.
Oh, kia ora. Thanks, Joe, for the question. Essa, what you were saying was like basically my answer, really. I love what you were saying about, you know, I think poetry, and probably all writing, but I think poetry is really good in particular about like posing the question rather than the answer, and not trying to solve something, but trying to like reckon with it. And I think that's maybe more what draws me to that particular medium rather than necessarily life writing itself. But yeah, I guess for me, I'm not like necessarily a life writer, but in my last book, The Surgeon's Brain, I wrote about James Barry, Dr. James Barry, who's on the cover. Some say there's a resemblance, but he's not a self-insert figure. He is a real person. He was born in the late 1700s and had a very successful but also like turbulent career as an army surgeon. He came from Ireland but joined the British Army and travelled around the British Empire and performed these incredible sort of surgical feats. Everywhere he went, the death rates in the hospitals would drop because he had this magical idea about washing your hands. And it was only on his death that it was discovered that, in the language of the time, he had been born female. And since then, he's been the subject of, a play by Charles Dickens, all sorts of different biographies and accounts. And so this was sort of my attempt to, I guess, write his life. And I think what drew me to it was not so much life writing itself, but just that particular life. As soon as I started reading about him, I was just like, oh yeah, there's the book. Like, I just have to write this now. And it was only once I started that the challenge of actually doing that became apparent, because I'd never really grappled with like having to write about something real before. Yeah, I guess that's sort of my relationship with life writing.
Brilliant. Oh, fantastic. I'm just actually wondering, and this is sort of, I think this question actually spans our group and the different perspectives or approaches we have. So what is taboo? Is there anything, if anything, to your writing? What subjects, are there anything that you feel is sort of best left unsaid? Anything that you shouldn't write about, or is everything up for public kind of scrutiny and publication? So, do you?
I think the line is always moving, and it's contextual. It's changing over time. And I was, in thinking about preparing for the session, thinking about people that had inspired me and mentored me. Michael King was a really important person for me. And I interviewed him a few times, and I used his work. And people all know, he wrote a biography of Janet Frame, he wrote a biography of Frank Sargison. And I remember a thing he said, that the biographer's duty was to go as far as the bedroom door, but not beyond. And, the fact for him, as a straight man, the fact that Sargison was gay was significant, but not what he did as a gay man. And he said he actually knew quite a bit about that, but he didn't go there. And I'd completely, and it's of course it was a huge tragedy that Michael died so young, because I would have loved to have taken him on about that, because I think that's wrong, and that's not how I would have approached it, and it's certainly not how I approached writing about Charles Mackey and Darcy Cresswell. For me as a queer man, it was really important to engage with that and understand why you'd leave your clothes, boots and shoes to a Coldstream guardsman when you're living in London. These men who were famous for selling themselves for sex. I mean, that seems a bit of a coincidence. But I know that if a lovely book that I still think is a great thing to read is Tread Softly for You Tread on My Life, Biography and Compassionate Truth. And it's a fantastic collection of essays about writing biography. And I remember Christine Cole-Catley, who was a great friend of Michael's, saying, biography works differently in New Zealand because it's really small. I mean, basically, you've got to have courage, but you've got to be prepared to live with the consequences of what you write. You've got to be brave, but this is a small country. Yeah. Because I wanted to ask you, I mean, yes. It should be fair, really, for you to tell us why you were attracted to life writing, and now you've produced this new book, which I haven't read yet because it's only new, where you've actually turned things around on yourself. But what was it that attracted you to life writing?
I actually started out as an art historian. So, I mean, it was all about the work, and it was all about the object, really. And I couldn't help but see that the object was really created by the life. And that, in fact, you couldn't really understand the object if you couldn't understand the life as well. So, and in the end, I began to find the life became almost more interesting, really, than the art history. And, so life moved in front of the creation, for me, and it became material in itself and something of great fascination. And I guess after writing 6 biographies, you kind of eventually think, maybe it's my turn. You know, maybe it's the moment when you turn the lens back on yourself, and you actually have to actually measure up to all of the things that you did to people cruelly, I think. but with some compassion, because I totally get what you're saying about Michael King. It's a wonderful book, and it is really helpful. And because one of the questions I was going to ask is, do we bring a moral compass to our work? And what might that be? And does that have is there any point on your compass? So maybe we could kind of, I don't know, Esme, do you have a moral compass? I mean, that's a good question for you to answer. Let's go for it.
Oh, I'm just like flashing back to first year philosophy with like Immanuel Kant and anyway. So I have a moral compass. I think the biggest line I crossed was writing about my partner's farts. But I don't know. I think I'm sorry. It's the one thing I shouldn't have said.
You're going to laugh now.
I think when you're writing, I think you should be able to put down whatever you need to put down on the page at the time. But I think it's different when you're thinking about putting it into the world, because your writing affects communities, and I think you owe something to your community and the communities that your writing is about. And so I think you have to think quite deeply about that kind of thing, and talk to people, and you know, have these like difficult conversations, hopefully before the book is in the world, but sometimes that's not always how it works. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I try to be critical of the things I don't like and uphold the things I do. I think that's like my moral compass. You know, yeah, I don't know. And always trying to draw people to kind of works by like other people, by queer Māori and other queer writers, and kind of, there's like this quite big fixation on firsts in the Māori community, and like outside the Māori community, but like looking in at it, and on the queer community, like this is the first book by a trans person, or this is the first film by blah blah blah, or whatever. And I think that always does a disservice to the whakapapa of all the like kind of traditions that have come before and informed that. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, is like where you come from, and you know who you're owed to. There was like some research I did for Alistair Munga Somerville, where I was looking at Te Ao Hou, the periodical that ran for like 50 years, and there was so much cool poetry I'd never seen before by Māori writers in there, and they were like dealing with questions that I had, and they were doing it so well, and I was like, cool, I don't have to do that anymore. Like, I can just go read this person's done really well, and then you can like continue the conversation rather than starting again, which I think is a thing that we're kind of, sometimes we're trapped in a loop of having to answer the same questions over and over. And I think having that whakapapa perspective is really important, because then you can progress. I don't know. I'm going to give it to Oscar.
Thanks, Essa. Oh, I've been worrying someone would ask me this question my whole life. Just to skip over that question and go back a little. I guess just this is not really a moral sort of delineation, but sort of on what we write about and what we don't write about. I think the thing that I don't really write about directly is myself, and I really love confessional poetry. I don't know, Essa, if you would use that word to describe your writing, but when people are tapping into how they're feeling, and like, I think I would often call a lot of your poetry like really raw, and it's something that I love about it. I mean, it's also often very beautiful as well. Don't mean to put you in a box or anything, But you know, that's the poetry that I really love, and I think we have so many amazing examples of it in Aotearoa. And I'm just really not that. And it's really cool, actually, because I just feel like it's almost like, you know, there are all these amazing writers who are talking about like queer sex and queer experiences and how they're feeling in the moment. And that I feel like I'm like, cool, well, I'm free to go talk about the 1800s. Because that's just what I think what guides me is like what I can write about, because I feel like my skill and my talent is like very limited. Like it's very like this narrow line of stuff that I'm actually like physically able to write about. And if I go beyond it, it would just be horrific. And so just the breadth of like New Zealand writing allows me to stay in my channel and write about like, you know, history, or, you know, write villanelles, or write like sonnets in Excel, and just all the stuff, like the way that my brain works. So yeah, not really a moral thing so much, but more just about like what I'm capable of. But I love what you're saying about, you know, what you owe to people, because I think that's something that I kind of try to ignore, because I'm just like, oh, I'm just writing, I'm just by myself, it's all good. And which I think came up on the earlier panel about writing being so solitary, and I take like a lot of comfort from that. But then you have to be like, oh, well, people are actually going to read this, it is actually going to be in bookstores. And I think particularly like coming from a transmasculine perspective, it's like we do have a wonderful community or communities, and there is a literary tradition, but it's so fractured, and so small and so vulnerable. And so being a transmasculine writer at all, like at any level of writing, like even if you don't share it, it's like you're a part of this very quiet conversation. And I think just being like aware of that is quite terrifying, but I think it's like important to be aware of it, because you will be part of that conversation. You can't opt out of it. Yeah, which I think maybe like just resonates a little with what you were saying, Essa, about sort of what you owe people.
Yeah, I think it's great to put in some ways sort of be involved in those conversations, create those conversations with your work. Otherwise, it remains that those discussions don't happen, and if you're not putting it out there, it's not happening, is it? In a way. So, I guess, do you feel? And my next question is, queerness, homosexuality. Do you think that writing about sexuality and identity has become easier? Is it easier? Is it freer? Are the barriers and limitations to those discussions still, or do you feel you can engage in a career in which your work will be received well, can be published? So anybody.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think this is just my personal experience, is that it's been really cool to just be like, well, I am a trans writer and I'm going to write about trans things. And I had some really interesting conversations with my first book where I wanted to call it New Transgender Blockbusters, and I got some feedback, and I won't say from who, they were lovely people, but, you know, do you want to put that word on your book because you're not just a transgender poet? Yes. And I was like, well, I am though, like, I'm other things, but I am that, and so I pushed back a bit, and I'm glad that, you know, they were happy to, you know, have that conversation, which I think was a useful conversation to have. But yeah, and I like personally, I don't think I've had any like bad repercussions. I mean, I have like, you know, people say ignorant things to me, or, you know, all this kind of thing. But like, yeah, I think it's awesome, and I just feel really privileged is probably the best word, that I'm able to be in that space and write about what I like, and, you know, I don't feel like I'm missing out on things. But then I think that's my experience. You know, I wouldn't say that's everybody's. And I think there's definitely, you know, I've certainly read and heard some very toxic takes on my work, which is, you know, I think it's good to remember that we're not in a utopia. Yeah. And there's always, you know, always room to improve and to push to the next sort of frontier of progress. But yeah, I do think I've been very lucky myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Essa, do you want to grab that? How do you feel? Do you feel that there is, it's much easier to write about and be published when you're dealing with those issues of sexuality and identity, queerness?
Well, I'm quite young, I think. Well, I'm almost 30, but like, I think, I don't know. I think things have, I don't know. I feel like poetry for me has always been quite a good place for like queerness. Like, you open up any kind of journal of, poetry or writing in New Zealand, and there'll be like, a certain amount of queer writers, and I think it's only growing, and I think that's really cool. And yeah, I don't. With Ransack, I was real concerned about like the response, because it was like I have poems in there which are like, this is what non-binary means. Like there was kind of some sense of like talking to a specific audience in there, and then the response was like, fine. And then with Echidna, I got like the response I expected for Ransack to Echidna, which I, complaining about they, them pronouns and whatnot, and I'm like, Echidna uses she, her. Like, that's real simple. I did you a solid. Yeah, I don't know, and I guess that does make it a bit more difficult, but I think within the literary community at large, there's a lot of like support and encouragement at the moment, and so that's really helpful. But yeah, I don't know. I really feel for like trans siblings overseas, especially like looking at like media hell in the United States and the UK, where like certain kind of anti-trans ideology is like taken over, and I feel I feel very privileged to be in a place where that kind of conversation is kind of kept in, I don't know, halls that David Seymour wants people to meet at. But I think when I'm writing, I feel comfortable writing about whatever I want to at the time.
So Paul, you're writing. You've been writing about something that was so sort of shameful in its time that it sort of really was silenced. So how's your experience? What's your experience? Do you think it's easier now? Are the gatekeepers that you've struck, other than your editor?
Well, there are some gatekeepers in terms of historical research. That is a whole area I'm quite concerned about in terms of access to archival material, which we could maybe talk about. But just to build on what these two are saying, there is a big difference between the things you write down and the things you choose to then take the next step and give it to other people and let it go out into the world. But when you let things go out into the world, you're working with publishers, who all of us have worked with. And you learn a lot when you talk to publishers, because they look at books in terms of commercial potential, and you start to hear about these things called subvention payments. Is that what they're called? But it was really lovely being at your book launch this week, Jo, and how proud your editor and publisher, Harriet Ellen, was.
Oh, she's awesome.
About how, I'm trying to remember what she said, but it was like, this is a breakthrough. There really hasn't been much like this in terms of this sort of memoir. And when you talk to a publisher, they ask you about audience, and they say, who's your book for? And you go, oh, everyone. And and then, but when I was really tested on that by Nicola Leggett at Massey University Press, we was thinking, well, it's this audience, people with an interest in queer stuff, queer history, and the people who come along to the talks at the Turnbull Library where I work. But that sometimes things surprise you. And this is where I think maybe, Essa's right. We are lucky to live in a country like this, but it's important to think a bit more globally and think about territories and countries where people don't have the same freedoms we do. But the biggest surprise to me has been all these straight, middle-aged, elderly men who've been reading my book over summer, because all my friends have given it to their dads. And and I've been being sent photos of fathers in campgrounds with their head in this book. and these people vote for David Seymour, and you know, and my friends are saying, my father never reads books, but he says, this is a book I like to read. But you know, I would have never thought that people would go, hey Dad, I'm going to give you a book about a homosexual blackmail case in Wanganui for Christmas. So so you never know.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this
Yeah.
has happened for you, Joe, and the others. So that's why it's important to write what it is you want to write. And the previous session was fabulous, and I thought it really does boil down to that. The colour purple, the bone people, the books that inspire people that were talked about in the previous session. And I'm still buzzing from hearing Josiah Morgan saying, when he's only just recently read The Bone People, and he said, that's what the writing of this country is. And I thought, that's so exciting. Because at the Turnbull, we've just bought the manuscript of The Bone People, and that came up, Kerry's whānau auctioned that. And but it's really awesome to hear new writers coming through and discovering that and saying, it's a modernist novel, you might have trouble with it, but it's still worth reading. And that's really inspiring. So you never know where your work is going to find its homes and readers, and that's exciting.
And I think, you know, New Zealand writers, actually, their work is finding legs in places that are unexpected and running full tilt. It is exciting. It's and you never, once something's public, it's like, I don't know, I mean, I've had two children, I've given birth to children, I've given birth to a few books. I think the unexpected nature of children and books is pretty similar. You're never sure where they're going to end up or what they're going to do to you, but especially what they're going to do to you. But maybe my children, when they read the book, will anyway have an agenda. But yeah, it is exciting. I guess that's what you do. You let go, don't you? I mean, you let go of your work, and you release it into the world. And in a way, the world takes over your story, and it absorbs it into its worlds. And people, the readers, become affected by those the words, the histories, the stories that you've written and told. I'm wondering, because we're dealing with sort of auto and biography, but I'm thinking that how do you navigate facts when you deal with facts? How do you navigate subjectivity? I mean, if it's about you, how do you fact check? So I'm gonna splinter that into two things. So if you're not writing about yourself, how many pieces of evidence do you need, and how do you handle speculation? So how many pieces of evidence do you need to make a fact? How do you handle speculation and subjectivity? Do you do you audit? Do you ask other people about your life? Do you fact check yourself? So there's a couple of questions. I hope I've slightly tailored them to each of the panelists tonight. I feel like it's tonight. Okay, go for it. Anybody?
I mean, I'll talk a bit about my own experience, but I was again thinking of people whose writing I find interesting, and David Sedaris is someone that I really love reading his work, because he's like created a sort of a genre of his own. It's sort of based on his own life, but it's composite. He manipulates the memory, and so they're not like memoirs. But it's again that thing about literary truth. You sort of buy it. And I don't know how his family feel about being so much part of his writing. But that's something I've really enjoyed. Back to my editor, and in the field I write in, you can have footnotes, and that's important to me because it's a way of people tracing my path and being able to build on it. And I agree with you, Essa. It's really important to acknowledge that whakapapa of people. Peter Wells was the person who wrote about the story that I've written about in Downfall in a book called Best Mates, which was an anthology of gay New Zealand writing. And at the front of that, there's this fantastic essay where he just mapped out all of this sort of history of, Samuel Butler, Frank Sargison, all of these things, and this crazy story about Darcy Cresswell and Charles Mackey. That was where I first heard about it. Other people heard about it a bit later in Michael King's Penguin History of New Zealand, but it was really neat for me that it emerged in that queer space, but I wouldn't have known about that if I hadn't had that book. And it's important like what you're saying too, that you create spaces. If Peter and Rex Pilgrim hadn't done that, then that book wouldn't have existed, and then these other things that have followed on. There's some sort of quite tricky stuff that I came across in writing this about something going on in Wanganui with older men and younger boys. And this is where it was very hard to imagine yourself into the time period where there's no age of consent, and all sex between men of any age is illegal. And Chris Brickle was a great help to me trying to think this through. He's written some great papers about this. But you know, there used to be these homes for orphans and naughty kids, and then the kids would be put into service as domestic workers, or I guess working for people. And in the Police Gazette, there's this reference to this young, I think he might have only been about 14, boy who was in the service of Charles Mackey in Wanganui, and he'd escaped. And there was a call out from the police for this boy. And I was like, what the hell's going on here? Why did Charles Mackey have a 14-year-old boy working for him in his office? And I was trying to write about this, and Anna Rogers really challenged me about how I wrote about that. And she said, look, you need to be really careful that you're not making too many leaps and extrapolating and saying what you think that relationship was.
Yes.
So if you look in the footnotes in this, I've been quite careful about that. And I can stand by what I've said. And it was that's what I mean. The right editor for whatever area you're writing in is so important, and you've got to trust them. And in my case, I mean, a good editor, they stop you falling into holes. And it is hard. I mean, I guess I write a lot about dead people who can't defend themselves.
Yes.
And maybe that's that compassionate truth
idea.
I think it's a bit different when you're writing about people who are still alive. But I'm really grateful for that sort of help. And it might be that people follow on behind me and are able to learn more about what actually was going on. I mean, these two men, when the blackmail happened, they had 4 meetings, and then there was a blackmail on Friday night, and then they met again on Saturday. In between that time, another man in Wanganui hanged himself in his laundry, who was married and had children. And I just couldn't help but think, you know, if there's a suggestion that there was a group of men in Wanganui involved in some sort of group of men having sex with younger men. And I just thought, that's so weird that in that sort of 8 hours between when Charles Mackey, who according to oral history in Wanganui sort of took the rap for something that was going on that involved a lot of other men, for a man to kill himself in that period in Wanganui just seemed to me a little bit weird. But Anna said to me, look, you've really got to be careful how you write about that. So when you talk about taboos and boundaries, and I mean, I'm in the area where you can fact check and you can put in your archival sources, and that I think that is in there as well, but it's very carefully stated so that I'm not actually making that leap and saying this was happening, but I think just noting that had happened as well.
Yes. Oscar,
Yes.
because in a way you've got the same sort of territory.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny what you say about evidence, because I'm also a lawyer, and I'm mostly a litigator, so I'm mostly a court lawyer. And so a lot of my day job is thinking about like balance of probabilities, beyond reasonable doubt, where do these facts lie along those lines. And so then reading about James Barry, who, you know, there's been a lot of biographies of James Barry, and then there's the primary sources, and then there's the biographies. And I'm not a historian at all. I didn't really, I did the research that was available to me. I read a lot online. I got out a lot of books from the library, but I wasn't visiting archives or doing that kind of deep research. But yeah, it was really interesting because you look at the primary sources and you just think, oh, well, you could take this 100 different ways. Like, there are court records. I think he was court-martialed at least once. There are a number of records of him having duels with people. He was just really argumentative. And there's also a lot of documentation about a relationship he had with Lord Charles Somerset, who was essentially almost in the position of a king of the British colony of South Africa at the time, and had a very close relationship with the general surgeon at the hospital there, James Barry, but to the point that it was quite suspicious and I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but someone placed a sign in the main street of Cape Town, which said that he had seen Lord Charles Somerset buggering Dr. Barry. And this caused this huge sensation, worldwide headlines. So a lot of what we know about James Barry comes from this one incident. Wow. And it was eventually sort of blew over, and people said, oh, it was just a feud or a vendetta or something, not that long after that, Lord Charles Somerset decided he wanted to leave Cape Town, and he went back to the UK. And then not long after that, James Barry left as well, and sort of went on this kind of journey for the rest of his life, going through the Caribbean, going through Europe, never really settling down in one place after spending 12 years in Cape Town with Lord Charles Somerset. And again, it's like you could take that a million different ways, and it's a little bit like what you're saying there, Paul. I mean, luckily enough, being a poet, I can decide. And I don't have, you do have an obligation, I think, but the obligation is to your truth, not necessarily the truth. So even though looking at the facts, I didn't feel that on the balance of probabilities, I could say that they had a relationship, I thought that is one interpretation. And if they hadn't, someone else would have, and that story's been lost, and we'll never know that story. So let's explore this story. Yeah. And so I kind of had to make choices because, James Barry's life is just a succession of gaps. And in fact, some of the poems have gaps in them, because I think you have to acknowledge the fact that you don't know everything and you can't answer every question. But also to have a compelling narrative, you do kind of have to come down on one side on some of these questions, like, what was that relationship? And also the central or what a lot of people see as the central question of James Barry's life, which is how did he identify? And you can, I don't think anyone can know that except for him. But at the same time, I kind of have to decide what pronoun I'm going to use because I'm going to be talking about him a lot. Yep. And so I make the choice that feels right to me, which is, I think, a freedom that you get from being in the poetry world. Yes. Yeah. I do have footnotes in one of my poems, but they're not helpful.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Actually, maybe, Esme, do you want to talk about subjectivity? Or
I was going to talk about how I was thinking about how you two take these stories and try to, like, I don't know, be faithful to something. Yes. Whereas a lot of the stories in Echidna, I am trying to distort or subvert. So like I have a poem about Sisyphus. I mentioned Sisyphus because there's like a lot of memes about Sisyphus on Twitter at the moment. But he tries to get immortality, and then he's punished by the Olympian gods to roll a boulder up a hill for the rest of eternity. And I was thinking about like what other ways we could spin this story, and so I kind of make the like joke about him being revolutionary because the boulder is revolving. And like this idea of he's actually pushing it up the hill so he can like drop it on the Olympians or something like that. So yeah, a lot of what I do is trying to inject my subjective viewpoint into the thing and being like, where is the queerness in this story? I have a series of poems that are about Maui, Portiki, and Prometheus being lovers, and there's like some things I take from the Purako and the mythology because they're like interesting. And so there's a poem about Maui dies. It's kind of more complicated than that because I didn't want to do the bury you're gay trope. But Prometheus has a really hard time understanding this happening because Prometheus is also cursed with immortality. And so like you can pull from these stories and these traditions and kind of make something else out of them that can be like queerer or more you or more the world that you know. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
Maybe I could add a little bit on the concept of subjectivity. Writing a memoir is a moment of distillation where you have to kind of face, your interpretation of things and put it up against other people's. And I guess because I suppose it's regarded as non-fiction, you have an obligation to try and get the facts as accurately, and there's not so many opportunities to put footnotes in there, so you've got to kind of audit yourself, and I think that's always a bit shocking, because what you retain and remember and how you feel it went is quite often challenged by other people's perspectives, and it's quite a, I think that is something that I actually learned that I needed to do, because I thought, I'm an authority on my own life, and of course our lives are not, our stories are not just one life. There are a whole lot of, and I think that's one of the questions that is quite interesting for our panel to think about, and everybody else perhaps, is who owns your story? Who owns your story? And that is, how many lives does it involve? Does it transect or kind of create issues for other people, for the children perhaps of Maki and other people who have a connection to that story?
Yeah, I was very, very nervous about reaction from people in Wanganui to Downfall, but it's been really positive, actually. The towns, they've been badgering me to finish the book, and some people have come forward with some interesting new information, which is good as well. Wanganui does have some of these families who've been there for generations and generations. But just this thing about ownership of stories, it came up a wee bit in the earlier session here this morning. And I remember Ranginui Walker, when he published his biography of Sir Upperton, the Ngāti Porou leader and politician. And Ranginui was from Te Whakatō here, iwi, and he said, there's room for a Pākehā biography of Ngāti, there's a room for a Ngāti Porou biography of Ngāti, and I always thought that was great, because I don't think we lose anything from having these other perspectives. Because it came up this morning, can only we write about ourselves? I mean, this comes up a lot with Māori, of course, at the moment. And I think there is room for other perspectives. I work at the Turnbull Library, which is full of collections about Māori. There's some material by Māori, but there's much more about Māori. But I read an Indigenous, a black academic, I think, writing about how she thought you could read sources against the grain and they could be still empowering and useful. And I actually believe that. I think my project at the moment is writing a chapter on early photography, and I'm looking at some of the photos we have in a soldier's album of the Great South Road being built and of Māori at Pōkeno. And not much is known about these images, but they're Māori selling peaches and melons. And for me, they're extraordinary evidence of the economic base that fed Auckland and was just wiped out by the building of that road and the invasion of the Waikato. And it's in an album that was owned by a soldier that was taken to England and then given to the Turnbull Library in 1940. But I still think it's quite an interesting piece of evidence for us, and so I'm talking to Ngāti Tamoho about what they think about those photos and how that could be included in what I'm writing. So I like that. Again, in the previous session, there was talk about multiplicity and diversity, and I think that's probably where I'm at as well. I think there's room for lots of different perspectives, but it'd be interesting to see what these two think. Who owns the stories?
I don't know. I think the community, the community does. Like, this book isn't my book. It's for all the takatapui nerds. I think, and I don't know, and then they can take. There was something I talked about a while ago in regards to Echidna. Is it has all these threads that reference different traditions and stories, and characters from heaps of different stories. And the idea is they're like threads that people can pull on if they want, and write their own responses or add to their thing. So I view this book as like a starting point for other people to do stuff with, because I think we need to be more in conversation with each other, because when we are, it exposes so many cool things to the light.
Yeah, I don't know if this is really an answer to the question, but what you were saying, Paul, about reading things against the grain really struck me. Like I said, I was doing research for this book, and I read a few biographies of James Barry, and I sort of wrote the book out of spite, because the biographies were just coming from the cis heterosexual perspective. And it was just like, it was quite, in a way, it was like a little bit damaging to read them and quite infuriating. It was also just kind of hilarious. Like, I think sort of the definitive book, and it was actually really helpful, like you were saying, it's the most thorough biography of James Barry, and I honestly, for the life of me, can't remember the name, but it was published, I think, in about 2016, so there's absolutely no excuse for this. In the biography of James Barry, which has 1 million footnotes, and, I think it's maybe 300 or so pages long, there's one footnote about, the possibility that he could have been transgender. And it says, well, no, he couldn't be because people at the time said he had a feminine voice, which there's just so many layers to unpack there. I mean, yeah, I won't, we don't have time. But, it was just sort of that thing of like, this is a really helpful book. And I think if you want to know more about this person's life, I think it's a good book to read. But the fact that someone could write about this person in 2016 and not grapple with questions of identity and gender was just so shocking to me that I was like, I must kind of write this. And I think sort of that idea of multiplicity, it's not about like removing that book from the libraries or like, I think it is a helpful book, but it's just about saying, well, hey, this is someone who actually means a lot to the trans community and to trans men, and also to intersex people and to non-binary people. And, we should have that voice be heard when we talk about him, and not just as someone wrote online, again, sorry, I'm not very good with names, but someone said online, the funny thing about James Barry is he had this incredible life, and it can be interpreted so many different ways, but whenever you do hear about him, and he's not sort of super famous, but he's someone who you do hear about if you read sort of medical history. It's always the most cisgender, most heteronormative perspective that wins through. And just, I think that's what's so beautiful, is that we've had those stories about all sorts of different marginalized communities, and now we're getting like the stories layered on top that were there all along but just weren't being heard. And that's just beautiful. Sorry, Paul.
That's a great example, though, of how gaps and absences can speak really loudly and can actually be a great source of evidence or a spur to do something. And I mean, I was trying to write about someone who was literally erased. His name was chiseled off the stone of the Sargent Gallery in his title, and then it got put back again, and currently it's gilded as part of a photography project by the photographer Anne Shelton. When she had a residency in Wanganui, she asked the council, she found the original specifications for that stone, it was going to be gilded, so she asked them if she could gild that name. So he's now the only gilded name there. I just wanted to mention a book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey by Julia Late, that came out in 2021. And this, Julia Late's a British historian, but Lydia Harvey was living in Oamaru and came to Wellington, was working for a photography studio in the Hut, didn't like that, came into town, and then met this glamorous couple who sort of promised her a trip to Buenos Aires, and so she went with them, and it was a prostitution and trafficking of these young women. This is in 1910. And so this woman, historian, has tried to restore this woman to the archives, because she to history, because women like her just got forgotten about and eliminated. All the other people, the judges and the people that she came in touch with, they're remembered, but women like that are not. And each chapter is told from the perspective of the people that she met. So the journalist in London who wrote about the story, and it was so sensational that the New Zealand government suppressed it because they thought that was a bad look for there to be stories about New Zealand women being trafficked for prostitution to Buenos Aires and then London. But I just love that idea that you can restore people back. I mean, you can riff on famous, enduring stories and characters like Maui and Prometheus and Sisyphus, and you can also apply a completely different lens and tell the untold story for other characters. So there's a lot of scope.
Yeah. Oh, well, actually, unfortunately, I think we could go on, and I think we're going to have to wind things up now. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Did
yeah.
you really not find anything?
Well, I did. I actually got taken to task in a review for calling her a lesbian, so I did find some things. To be but I mean I always left it open. But yeah, I mean very secret kind of backgrounds. People were incredibly careful about what they revealed publicly, and also there were of that generation, of her generation, quite a group of people hanging around trying to help them stay in the closet, not be visible, not be shown. So you're actually up against their stories as well, because they continue the invisibility. In fact, feel as though they're doing the person a favour. So they actually feel as though they're doing because and some of them, believe it or not, were homosexual themselves. So in fact they felt like they were they were really projecting their own homophobia of themselves, their self-loathing in a way onto protecting someone else's story from. So yeah, it's a very complicated thing, isn't it?
Yeah, because people, as we've said, haven't always lived in times with the same freedoms
That's
as us.
right.
And one of the things I learnt writing Downfall is that if you were a gay man back in the day, it wasn't really the police you had to worry about, it was the other gay men. Because there was so much incentive to save your own skin.
Yeah.
Because you might go to, well, that's what happened to Frank Sargison. You might go to jail.
Yes.
And it's hard to get your head into that. And you're right,
Yeah.
Joe. There were lots of things operating where people would behave really oddly.
Yes.
And to our eyes. But
And the most unexpected people, the people that you would have thought would have been thrilled to have this story come out, they were all very clamped. But I think there's enough evidence to to make some claims. Yeah, but it's very difficult. It is difficult, and then you get all the backlash, the bad reviews, because all the gatekeepers are scurrying for their pens so that no one will read the book or buy it. Better still. Any yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, when writing historical fiction, do you impose, like someone's, like, let's say, left-wing liberal values of the present onto, like, historical characters? Or do you write from their racism or, like, their prejudices or things that are problematic from that historical time?
So what frame do you use to look at it? Do you use a current, or do you look at it from the perspective of the subject? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a challenge. I know for me, writing about James Barry, like he was part of, the colonial machinery. He was an army surgeon in the British Army. And his career basically spanned, the whole British Empire, probably pretty much with the exception of Australasia. But at the same time, he was Irish Catholic, which he hid when he sort of took on his new identity. He was anti-slavery. He was very progressive for his time. But if you picked him up and dropped him here in 2023, he would not be progressive, right? And so I think sort of trying to honour who these people are, but also honour the context that they were in, the incredibly violent and oppressive context that they were in and that they were a part of. It's like a huge challenge. I mean, I think for me, I just felt like I have to write about this person, and what comes into his story, I will try to honour, but rather than trying to capture more broadly than that, because I just thought the book is not big enough for that. But yeah, I think it is really hard, because you don't want to try and sort of like, turn someone into a saint kind of thing, even though you might really admire them.
If there's no one else, you can grab these people at lunchtime and drill in all the questions and answers you want. So but I would like to thank again, and everybody's got their book here. So can you flash them up, guys? People. Here we are. So the Fabulous Women's Bookshop is over there. Okay, so thank you very much. You've been a wonderful panel. Thank you for all your insights that you've shared. Thank you. And thanks for coming.